You know, it is always a wonderful thought to know that people are listening to my messages, that they're taking home, they're applying what I've said, that they really understood my sermons. And 40 years ago, I had a tremendous illustration of that. It impacted me in a lot of ways when an elderly lady in the church called me, and she said, "Boy, Brother Schneider, you've made a tremendous impact upon my granddaughter." And I said, "I have?" And she said, "Yes, I was keeping Kimmy the other day, and I looked out my back window, and she had gotten the hose and had stuck it down a hole and turned the water on full blast." And I said, "Well, what does that have to do with me?" And she said, "Well, apparently," she said, "I went out and talked to Kimmy. Kimmy, what are you doing?" And she remembered that you made a reference in your sermon last week to fighting with that old devil. We need to wrestle and fight against the devil and the works of the devil. I was probably preaching on Ephesians or something. And she said, "Kimmy, what in the world are you doing?" And she said, "Our preacher said we should fight and wrestle against the devil, and I've got the hose and I'm sticking it down here and I'm going to drown that old thing." So she, I guess, was taking my sermons pretty seriously. Mary said to her granddaughter, "Kimmy, do you like our preacher?" Just a little child. She said, "Oh yes, he's just like Jesus." I thought, oh, if she only knew, you know. But how I wish it was so. What would it be like? What would it mean for us to be just like Jesus? What would it be like if our lives were patterned after His, if they were formed after His, if we could follow Him in His manner and His way of life? Well, one thing I can tell you would be happening in our life, myself included, we would all be praying a whole lot more than we are. Because Jesus was a man of prayer. His life was steeped in prayer. His life was formed and fashioned in prayer. And the scripture that we read this morning is from Luke chapter 6. It's about the calling of the apostles. It says, one of those days Jesus went up to a mountainside to pray. That was very common. He would get away, go a place where he could be alone. And he said he spent the night praying to God. How many of us have spent a whole night praying to God? There have been a few occasions in my life. I remember when Bishop Hayes was here in Bishop, he confessed to a couple of us one time. He said, "You know, there are times when I wake up in the middle of the night and I am thinking about the Oklahoma conference. I'm thinking about situations in the conference." And he said, "I'm troubled and I can't sleep." And he said, "I just get up and pray." And he said, "There have been times when I have literally prayed all night long until I've broken through," was the term he used, "and found a peace where I could finally get some rest." And in doing that, he was modeling somewhat of the life of Jesus, who at times, as he was thinking about his life and things coming and things going on, when he spent an entire night in prayer. And as we look at his life, we see this example throughout the course of his life, how prayer was an essential part. It was part of the fabric of his life, and how literally he, and I found this term several years ago, and I like this term, he literally prayed his way through life. That is a neat term. He prayed his way through life. And I think Jesus invites his followers, he invites you and me to be people who literally pray our way through life. Just two key aspects I want to lift up this morning. First of all, just briefly looking at some ways Jesus prayed for himself, and then a few ways in which Jesus prayed for others. When I think about Jesus' prayer life for himself, we see this example here, how he prayed because he needed spiritual renewal in his own life. Stresses weighed upon him. Things entered into his mind. He had struggles and decisions he had to make. And there were times, it says, that he would go to a quiet place, sometimes to a mountainside, sometimes into a wilderness, sometimes by the seashore. He would find a quiet place where he could give his life to prayer and could spend time with his Father in prayer. He was praying because he needed personal and spiritual renewal within his life. We see from this example that he spent time in prayer, especially when there were big decisions to make. Here he was on the verge of selecting the 12 that would be his apostles. that when he was gone, these would be the people in whom he would entrust his message and entrust his work and entrust his kingdom. And to a large degree, whether or not these apostles were successful when he was gone was going to be the determining factor into whether his message spread throughout the then known world. He had to pick the right people. He had to pick the people who would be faithful and could carry forth his message. And so in facing large decisions, he spent extra time in prayer. We look at him in facing the conflicts with the scribes and the Pharisees, and towards the end of his life when he was arrested and tried and finally crucified. There came a point in time where he withdrew again to a Garden of Gethsemane, and he prayed, and he prayed, Lord, if possible, let this trial pass from me. That's not a bad prayer. There have been times when I've prayed, Lord, let my affliction be brief, or let it be smaller, or let it diminish. Let this pass from me. But then he said, Lord, most of all, help me to do your will. He wanted to be a person who was doing the will of his heavenly Father, even if it wasn't comfortable, even if it was challenging, even if it was going to be painful and bring heartache and affliction and suffering as it did. He wanted to be a person who did God's will. And when the disciples asked Jesus to teach them to pray, he taught them many of these same principles and shared with them that almost everything, whether we're asking for our daily bread in life, or we're asking how we deal with temptations and trials, or whatever the thing may be, that we're praying, oh Lord, thy kingdom come, your will be done on earth as it is in heaven. It's a way of saying, let your will be done in my life. What about you? Are there times in your life when you just simply need to be spiritually revived? Maybe it's a time to find a quiet place and spend some time in prayer. I remember a friend of mine years ago sharing the story of how he finally, in the midst of a very busy schedule, and he was at a church that was growing, and they were in a building campaign and going through staff changes, all kinds of things going on at the church, and he finally came to a point, he said, I just felt depleted. He scheduled a 3-day retreat. He went to a retreat center, and he said, Alan, he said, I spent half of my time in that retreat center praying and the other half sleeping. And he said, I had no idea until I got there. He said, it took about 1 day to totally unwind. He said, the next day I spent napping, and then I'd get up and pray, and then I'd go back and take another nap. And then I'd get up and pray, and then he said I would take another nap before dinner. And he said, I realized I'd gotten myself into such a schedule and such an active lifestyle. He said, I was becoming systematically sleep deprived. He said, I didn't realize it. I wasn't thinking straight. My emotions were all out of whack. I was very anxious. He said, I had no idea how sleep deprived I was until I got away from it all and got into a quiet place. And then I began praying, and God started speaking to me and convicting me about the way I was pushing my life, and in some ways pushing my staff and others in my life as well. I wasn't being fair to them either, and how I needed a time just to get away like Jesus did, and to pray and to think through these decisions, and for my physical being through sleep to be restored, and through my spiritual life to be restored in God's presence. And I am thoroughly convinced that if we could learn to follow after Jesus and to adapt his manner of life, that we could take these quiet moments of prayer, and in conflict, in trial, and decision moments, in times when we're just depleted and exhausted, to spend some time praying and being honest with God, that God would meet the personal needs that are often weights upon our life. But then I know, when you look through the Gospel of Luke and others, how often, in the variety of ways that Jesus prayed for others, and the type of people he prayed for, and it draws to our attention just how keen he was in his own spirit to the needs of others, and to his surroundings, and how he needed to be there for others, supporting them and encouraging them in prayer. In Matthew 19:13 and 15, it says that there were some people that brought some children unto him so that he could touch them and that he could pray for them. Jesus prayed for children. And that's the famous passage, where the disciples say, "Oh Lord, don't bother the Lord with these children. He doesn't have time for them." But he did. He not only had time to bless them, he had time to have a prayer for them. How we need to be in prayer for the children and youth of our church and our community. Of our world, really. I mean, when you hear some of the tragic stories and the challenges that young people are facing today, and desperately needing someone who will invest some attention and time through Scouts, through youth group, through Sunday school, through whatever it may be, just giving them some guidance and also some encouragement, but also spending time praying for our children, for our grandchildren, for our great-grandchildren, for the children of the Sunday school, for the children of this church. Jesus made one of his priorities to pray and to bless the little children that were brought into his presence. It's interesting how Jesus continually prayed for the spiritual development of his friends in Luke 9. It talks about him going up on a mountainside. He took Peter, James, and John that he might pray with them. Now, it may be at least partly the case that Jesus enjoyed the prayer team and the comfort of others that were praying with him, but I think a part of what he was doing with them was engaging them in their own spiritual development. He had big decisions coming before him. This was on the transitional point of his ministry when he would soon be arrested. And he brought them and say, we're going to pray together. We're going to be a prayer team about this. We're going to face these issues that will soon be coming together, that we can pray for one another. And Jesus knew, especially that after he ascended into heaven, that this mantle of the gospel was going to be laid upon them, that there was going to be another generation. He was going to pass this good news to others who were then to take it to the then known world. And Jesus prayed for the spiritual development of his friends. What about our close friends, people we work with, people in our family, people we know in our church? And each of us are in a journey. Each of us are taking another step. What is the next step for our friends? How can we be faithful in praying for our friends, for our brothers and sisters in the Sunday school, for our brothers and sisters in this church? Because we know there's another step for them. There are decisions that they are making. There are temptations that they are facing. There are circumstances that they are wrestling with. And what a comfort just to know that we can be available to them. That there comes points in life when we can pray for them. It's interesting in Luke 22, just before his denial, it says that Jesus was praying for Peter that he might not fall away. And it's so interesting how that verse is lifted up, because it says he is praying for him, but then he says when it's over, he's praying for his restoration as well before it even ever happens. And he's praying for Peter because he knows the temptation that's going to come his way. And he knows the embarrassment he's going to feel when he denies him. And he's preparing him and praying for him for this next stage and this challenge in his journey. When we look at the ministry of Jesus, it's so clear that he constantly prayed for the afflicted, for the hurting, for the sick, the lame, the lepers, for those afflicted, for those who were tormented, for those who were addicted, for those who were caught up in struggles within themselves that they didn't even understand, and the forces of evil with whom they were wrestling. Jesus constantly prayed for those people who seemed to be having a rough go in life. Either a physical or a relational or something was going on in the life. Maybe it was some kind of moral failure they were trying to face and overcome. Jesus prayed for them. Not prayers of curse, but prayers of enablement and blessing and empowerment, that they might be better and find the grace and the forgiveness of God. And in one of the most magnanimous prayers ever prayed, Jesus even prayed for those who hurt and opposed him. You know, that's tough. When there's people that are giving you a hard time, when there's people that are giving you grief, people that are criticizing you, people that are casting stones at you, for Jesus to be able to look at those people and say, Father, forgive them. They don't know what they're doing. They don't really understand. he forgave them, and he prayed that the Father would forgive them. And to be able to pray for those who, for whatever reasons, whatever circumstances we feel have been unkind or unfair to us or have hurt us in some way, to be able to pray for them. And the opportunity to pray for others just comes really from Jesus' ability to see and to look at the needs of others and to look sometimes past circumstances that others see and bring judgment, and to look into their inner needs. And it says so often that as Jesus saw the situation and the needs of others, there's a phrase that he was moved with compassion. Oh, that we could see people in such a way that our hearts could be moved with compassion, and then we could reach out to them and pray for them. I remember years ago, I was visiting a lady, and she had just given birth to twins, and I was visiting, and the husband had stepped out, but he had told me that he was going to be able to take some time off from work, and I was rejoicing in the birth of these two children. I said, well, it's so wonderful that your husband's going to be able to take some time off from work so he can stay home and be a help to you with these new two children. And she kind of smiled. She said, yes, the opportunity is there. And she said, if he'll only open his eyes and kind of see what that opportunity is. And then she was saying it kind of jokingly. But I thought about that what a word that is for each and every one of us. The opportunity is there for us to be involved in the needs and the lives and the circumstances and the hurt and the heartache of others, if we will only open our eyes and allow God to move us with compassion, because then we're going to want to pray for them. We're going to want to bless them. We're going to want to lift up their needs. We're going to want to let them know that we're with them in this journey, and we can pray. And what an impact Jesus had, because he sustained his own life. He found the answer to his own needs. He found the wisdom he needed for the decisions he had to make by stepping away and spending time in prayer. But then he was able to let that grace, that love, that forgiveness, that blessing flow out to others, from the children to the hurt to the lame, to those even who were giving him a hard time. He was able to be a blessing to others, and he could genuinely and sincerely pray for them and their welfare and their benefit and their healing, and that God would touch lives through him. And that's exactly what happened in his life and ministry. He was a blessing to others. And he's saying to his disciples and to us, this is the lifestyle. This is the way to find your way through life. It's not about having necessarily 7-point plan for effective living. It's just simply praying our way through life and allowing our lives to be centered, even as Jesus' life was centered. And he centered himself before the Father through his experience of prayer. And I'm convinced this morning that is what he was trying to teach his disciples, and it's what he wants to impart to us, and it's his invitation for us to follow him in being people of prayer, through whom God blesses us and ultimately blesses those about us through his grace and power. Thanks be to God. Amen.